May 30th, and I'm hoping that this will record for you, and that after I go through all the pain of making it work, that I won't be proven wrong that somehow I forgot. Now, I know that none of you have any trouble with that, but you know how technology is. First of all, I want to thank you for your patience with me. The last 3 times that I was speaking in Middletown, I used video, and this time I even told Pastor Dave that I'm going to be in Indiana this weekend. And so I asked him for his indulgence, and he said, well, you guys still wanted me to speak. So here we go. This morning is for May 30th. And again, we're looking at Ephesians. We're looking at the last section of Paul's theological section or discussion. And he gives us now kind of a transition into some very practical suggestions. So allow me to do a couple things with you. First of all, you see here, this is a piece of paper that has writing on it, and it's in plastic cover. But it's really hard to understand, isn't it? It's hard to read. Now, if I take it out of this plastic, you can see how it becomes much easier to read, doesn't it? I'd use this very simple illustration to show you the difference between the thinking of what inside. This is children of darkness. Because we are created in His image, even when we are children of darkness, there's a little bit of readableness that gets through, a little bit of light. But then, through Christ, our minds are changed and we become children of light. And it looks like that. And it's much, much easier to understand, isn't it? Because all of a sudden, it's gone from darkness or obscurity to being light. Today, Paul the Apostle is using the illustration or the imagery of children of darkness and children of light. And he's showing us that when we were children of darkness, we thought that was the best way we could see, because that's all we were used to. But now that we're children of light, we can see it clearly. I recall one time I was visiting in Thailand, and we were taken to this tourist town that was on the coast of Thailand. And it was the middle of the day, and I was walking around the town square. But what I noticed was there were prostitutes everywhere, looking for their business. And as I understood what was happening there, I realized I was standing in a place of darkness. It was the middle of the day, but I felt the darkness. Why does it work that way? One time I took my son, who at that point was a teenager, to see one of the most significant monuments in the city of Paris. And when we came up out of the subway to walk to the monument, I realized we'd gotten off one subway stop too early. And there we were in the daytime, standing in the middle of the red light district of Paris, the area called the Moulin Rouge. And there were ladies all over the place. So I told my son, who was a very handsome teenager at that time, we're going to walk from here, but when these ladies talk to you, don't talk back, don't respond to them, we just keep right on walking. And wouldn't you know it, they would proposition him. But we felt the darkness, even though it was in the daytime. Why does that happen? Why is it that when we come to Christ, all of a sudden we realize the darkness around us, but that we aren't a part of it? This is what the Apostle Paul is going to describe to us in our passage today. using the concept of children of dark and children of light. He's going to show us the things that happen, not in our character or walk, but things that happen in the way we think. So again, there's a sense in which Paul is setting us up. He's showing us that something happens to the way we think that directly will impact the way we behave. So children of darkness and children of light. This passage falls very neatly into two sections. Romans chapter 4, beginning with verse 17. He tells us about what it's like when we are children of darkness. And he describes to us what our mind is doing when we are children of darkness. Then in verse 20, he changes and starts talking about what it's like as children of light. But he explains why it is there is such a dramatic change when we become children of darkness. When we become children of light. So let's look at verse 17. So I tell you this, and I insist on it in the Lord. You must no longer live as the Gentiles do. He's using the term Gentiles now as a general term to describe the life we knew before we found Christ. So he's really not using an ethnic term here. He's using a spiritual term to describe a people who are completely separated from God. He says, you must no longer live as the Gentiles do. And now we get the first description of the mentality of someone who lives as a child of darkness, in the futility of their thinking, or in some of your Bibles, according to vain thoughts. The word here speaks of groundless, deceptive, and fruitless thinking. In Romans 12, it's called according to the mind of this world. Solomon discovered the uselessness of that when he talked about how it's vain thinking, it pursues the wind. And we all know how useful it is to pursue the wind. But he's saying your thinking is that way because you're pursuing the wind. Jacob was a good example of that. Jacob of the Old Testament. He was called the deceiver because for a large part of his life, he lived by deception. It was a vain and groundless way of life. He was called the deceiver because he was really good at cheating people. Paul tells us that's how you used to think. Another characteristic is in verse 18. They are darkened in their understanding. And so now he uses the word darkness to describe how people think. The Bible tells us it's a place of darkness and it's full of violence. He tells us in Psalm 115, it's an idolatrous way to think. And so if you were to go to Psalm 115, you see there where he talks about what that mindset is like. He says, you make these things out of wood so that you can worship them. You make them with eyes, but they can't see. You make them with a nose, but they can't smell. You make them with ears, but they can't hear. You make them with a mouth, but nothing comes out of their mouth. That is the way, he says, you used to think. And this is one passage in Psalm 115 where it's clear that people become like the object of their worship. And if they are worshiping a world of idolatry and of emptiness, then they become like that, empty in their thinking. And so Isaiah says these are people whose eyes are closed. They don't see. Their hearts don't understand. Darkness. I recall a young man at camp, youth camp, who was captured by this dark way of thinking. Everything he thought and everything he said had something to do with sexual immorality. He didn't even realize that normal people don't talk that way. But the darkness was so overwhelming in his life that he thought it was normal. Paul says, or Isaiah says, their eyes are closed. He gives us another quality of this person. He says, they are separated from the life of God. He's talking here about strangers, and that's the word that is actually used here. So folks, I know alien is a word that's commonly used. But the truth is, we become aliens to God. In other words, God is a strange land to us, and we don't know anything about it. The apostle tells us in Romans 8, they walk as enemies of God. And some of them may know God, he says, but they can't even thank him. And he uses the illustration that Jesus uses of blind leaders leading the blind. The Pharisees, Jesus called leaders of the blind, who were like tombstones that had great outward appearance, but were empty on the inside. Why is that happening? He tells us in verse 18, because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their heart. The reason why they are strangers to God is because their hearts have become hard. Like with Belshazzar, for example, whom Daniel told about the coming of another kingdom that would destroy him. But yet his heart was so hard. He could only exalt himself and could not even think about God. In Matthew 13, Jesus used the story of the parable of the sower or the planter. And he talks about how some hearts are so full of rocks that they're soil that can't even grow a new growth. Or Moses encountered Pharaoh, and after all of the miracles that God did in Egypt, Pharaoh still blamed Moses for his troubles, even to the point of calling him a demon. The hardness of their hearts makes them so ignorant of God that they are strangers to God, even to the point of calling those who are followers of God demons. That is darkness, folks. And in verse 19, Paul tells us that life as a child of darkness is one that has lost all sensitivity. They've given themselves over to sensuality, so to indulge in every kind of impurity with continual lust for more. Isn't that an interesting description of the world we live in today? It is so right to be in the dark, and it is so captivating that it leads them to want more and to want more and to want more. And they're never satisfied with that demon of immoral indulgence. It never stops pulling them. That is the life without the light. Yet there's enough light there that they think it's okay. But it's at this point that the apostle tells us that God gave them up. In 1 Peter, Peter tells us about how God gives them over to their envy and to their drunkenness, and how they make God to be a liar. And they practice every kind of impurity. So that even Job talks about how this person is actually drinking evil like it's water. And Isaiah calls this person a voracious dog. You see, people are walking in darkness. They have enough light that they can see that there's something there, but they can't read it. They can't see through it because it's normal, but they think everybody thinks that way. You know, one of the frustrations that I had as a new pastor was understanding why some Christians behaved the way they behaved. Yeah, they were baptized. Yes, they came to church. But they had attitudes and behaviors that just didn't fit. And I couldn't understand. Why is that way? Paul tells us why. Even though they may be calling themselves something else, their mind is still in the darkness. They are still children of darkness, and they will not understand as long as they are in there. I had a roommate in college who did not grow up in a Christian home. He grew up actually believing that all of the stuff of this world and the immorality and everything about it, it's normal. People do that. And when he graduated from high school, the very first thing he did to get out from home was to go and move in with his girlfriend. Now, there was a time when he was living this kind of a life that a Christian friend of his invited him to a rock concert. Now, because this young person was so excited about rock music, he chose to come. And he brought his girlfriend to this rock concert. And there was a person there who stood up front and started talking about the life without Jesus and describing it. And my roommate thought this person was describing him. He thought, he knows me, and they'd never met before. Well, you know the end of the story because you've heard these kinds of stories, but this young person came to Christ. And he moved from the darkness to the light, and nobody told him, but the first thing he knew was that he couldn't be living with his girlfriend anymore. And so back on their way to the apartment, they got in a fight, a huge fight, because the girl who did not come to Christ that night couldn't understand the change she was seeing in him already. All he knew was either they had to get married or split up. They got back to the apartment. She packed up her bags and left and never saw her again. The darkness was confronted by the light. And this boy who was living in the darkness came to Christ, and instantly something changed. What was it? The light confronted the darkness, and they can't be together. The Apostle Paul says about this kind of a lifestyle, he says in verse 20, you did not come to know Christ that way. That's a pretty strong statement. Apparently there must have been some people in the church of Ephesus who continued to try to keep their feet, a little bit in the world of the previous life. But the Apostle Paul says, no, it doesn't work that way. You did not come to Christ that way. And that's what he says to us today. If we think that we can compromise with the world that's around us and just kind of keep some of that stuff. You didn't come to Christ that way. What happened? Verse 21 now. We move into walking in the light. And this is a different way to do things. And the Apostle Paul's making it very clear. You see, these people at Ephesus knew that something changed. Because when they came to Christ, remember there were so many that came to Christ that they brought all their fetishes and their magic books and stuff and they burned them in the town square. And Demetrius, the silversmith, lost all of his customers because they weren't buying the silver goddesses anymore. Because when people came into the light, there was such a dramatic change that those who lived in darkness knew that there had been a change. And so he says, verse 21, as he begins to give us 4 characteristics of a person who walks in the light. And first of all, he says, surely you heard of him, that is Jesus, and were taught in him according to the truth that is in Jesus. Listen, when we walk in the light, we listen and obey Jesus. Just as we are taught in him, that's what we're supposed to be doing. And Paul is referring to his own teaching to them and saying, listen, this is what you learned. Listen to it. That's not the first time that listen is important to a new believer. Remember back after the transfiguration with Jesus, when Jesus took the 3 men to the top of the mountain and his whole appearance changed to look like godliness. And when it was finished, the disciples heard a voice, an audible voice, and they knew it was the voice of God who said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." That was not an invitation, sort of like a sitting back in the seat, the armchair, and saying to a visitor, "Here, come in, sit down." No, it's not an invitation. God was giving to the disciples very clear thinking orders. Listen to Jesus. So that Jesus could say to the disciples and even say to the crowd, "Those who follow me, listen to my voice," which is clearly suggesting that those who follow Jesus will never stop hearing his voice, even if Jesus were not there. And that's why he can say, "My sheep hear my voice, and they obey." You see, listening to Jesus not only implies, it requires obeying him. And that's what Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 28. "Teach them to do all things that I have said." You see, it's God's intention that we be, as the apostle says in Colossians, rooted and grounded in him. Jesus is the central focus of our teaching and our learning and our listening. That says something about Christian worship. It says something about Christian preaching. It says something about the Christian life. It's centered on Jesus. And so he talks about these clear instructions that I gave to you in verse 22. "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self." You see, there were clear instructions that were given. Paul told them, put it off. This is an active response to hearing the words of Jesus. There's an old way of life that we must separate from because we're following Jesus. And so, you remember Jacob, again, the deceiver? He came to his point of conversion when he got back to Bethel. And he told his whole family, "Now, go to the river, wash yourself, remove all of the old clothing, put on the new, and get rid of our gods." He was telling them that they could no longer live like they had lived when they were with Laban. Things are going to change now. We are children of God. And so Ezekiel gives us the invitation that comes from God. "Return to me and turn from your old ways." God's intent is that up here in our thinking, we make up our mind to follow the very clear instructions that Jesus gave us. And so he tells us in verse 23, to be made new in the attitude of your minds. Now, it's interesting that there are scientific studies being done today to figure out where attitudes and thoughts come from. Now, they know that the mind does it, so physically they can identify the place, but they can't figure out, where are the attitudes? Where are the thoughts? That's because those are the things that either come from God or come from the enemy of our soul and from the culture. And the Apostle Paul is saying in verse 23, be renewed in that. So first of all, we choose to put away the old. But when we do that, we turn to Christ, and he chooses to put that mind in us. And so again, just as the Apostle does in Romans 12, he tells us to be renewed in the way we think. That's not something I can do. It's something I allow the Spirit of God to do in Jesus and to do it in me. And allow that transformation to happen as he changes the way I think. So now my thoughts are new. And then in verse 24, when you've done all that, put on the new self. created to be like God. So here's a fascinating thing. I put on the new self, but it's a new self that God has created. And notice it's the word create. It's the word that means to make something out of nothing. So what I get as a new mind and as a new way of thinking is not something that I've made up. It's not something that I can do. No, it's something that He created, but I choose now to take it on as a part of me. Put it on, created like God, to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So people wonder, how can I become more like Jesus? Paul's answer is very simple. Put on the new. Change the way you think. And so just as he says in Romans 8, the rough things of life come along to transform us into the image of Christ. So I choose to put on the clothes. God chooses to continue to working in my life. So I begin to act and behave and to think more and more like Jesus. More and more like that person of righteousness and truth. And so we come back to the illustration. It's no longer trying to look at this through the plastic. It's seeing it clearly. See there? And when we begin to live in the light over here, we begin to realize there's an old way of thinking that I want nothing to do with. Because now there is really transparency. Because there's nothing in the way. And that's what I'm supposed to be thinking like. And the Apostle Paul makes it real clear. I choose, yes, to receive Jesus. I choose to become a children of light. But He changes the way I think so that I become a child of the light. Created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. We are no longer children of darkness. And even though the world around us is falling apart, we must choose to have God renew our minds and recreate our minds so that we begin to think like Him, so that we walk in the light as He is in the light and have fellowship with one another. But it happens when He changes the way our minds think. We all know the stories of Martin Luther. But back when he was still a monk, he was trying to discover, how can I get rid of this burden of sin? Even to the point that when he made a special trip to Rome, he went up those steps that are supposed to be the steps that Jesus went up when he went to Pilate. And he went up those steps on his knees, and on every step he stopped to pray for forgiveness. And getting all the way to the top, and he finished all of this work of kneeling up the stairs, and he discovered he still had that burden of sin. It still hadn't gone. Until one day in reading Romans 1, he discovered the gospel is the power of God to salvation to all who believe. It's in believing Jesus, it's in trusting Jesus that work begins to take place in me. But I must trust Him. And when Martin Luther did that, the burden was lifted. That's why later on in this passage, in this book, Paul can say, you didn't learn it this way. You learned about Jesus. So now walk in the way that you were taught. Put on the life of Jesus. Think like He thinks. And you'll be able to live in the light of the day as a children of light. Let's pray together. Jesus, I thank You that You want us to be children of light and that You've made every way possible for it to happen. Would You help us to yield to that power of the Spirit in our lives? In Jesus' name, amen.